Part 3. 2,500 years ago, poets were royalty. Advisors to kings, keepers of truth. Their words could start wars or end them. Today, most people think poets are irrelevant, broke, weirdos with journals. But here's the twist, they're staging a comeback. And this time, they're armed with microphones, algorithms, and rage. Welcome to Part 3, where we reveal how poets lost their power and how they're taking it back. Chapter 8. The Poet in History, from Prophet to Intellectual. Let's rewind. In ancient Greece, the poet wasn't some quiet guy scribbling in a cafe. He was a prophet, a politician, a rock star. Solon, one of Athens' founding fathers, didn't write laws, he wrote poetry. Because back then, poetry was law, poetry was truth, poetry was power. And in Celtic lands, meet the bards, not Shakespeare fanboys. These were hereditary poets for hire. Praise your king, you get gold. Insult him, you get cursed. Literally, their words could bless or destroy. But then, the fall. Rome turned poetry into an intellectual game, for elites only. The Enlightenment, poetry became pretty feelings. The Industrial Age, poetry got shoved into classrooms. By the 20th century, the poet was the useless dreamer, the out-of-touch artist. Sound familiar? We didn't just stop listening to poets, we stopped believing they mattered. Comment below. When did you stop believing poetry mattered? Or, when did you start? Let's get real. If you're hooked, don't forget to subscribe. New videos are dropping next week, and you won't want to miss them. The social role of the poet in Western civilization has undergone a profound transformation over the centuries. In ancient Greece, the poet was not a marginal or eccentric figure, but a master of truth and a custodian of the collective historical and mythical memory. His word, considered of divine and intrinsically political origin, was a means to support the values, laws, and institutions of the polis. Prominent political figures such as Solon and Alcaeus used poetry to convey their ideas and actively participate in public life. In a parallel development, professional poet-singers known as bards played an essential role in Celtic cultures, such as those of Ireland and Wales, where the institution survived long after it had disappeared in Gaul and England. Bards served as oral repositories and chroniclers, preserving the histories, genealogies, and heroic deeds of their tribes through verse. Employed by a patron, they were tasked with praising their monarch or chieftain and could also compose satires to denounce those who had crossed them. They were highly esteemed figures, often advising nobility and royalty. This function was vital in societies that maintained intricate oral histories and relied on poetic devices like meter and rhyme to facilitate memorization. While the term bard in the UK from the 16th century onward became a more general, non-specific title for any skilled poet, such as Shakespeare, the bardic tradition in Celtic areas remained a formal hereditary profession. In the Roman era, the social function of the poet shifted toward a more restricted circle of intellectuals who could understand the complexity of his techniques. With the advent of modernity, the relationship between poet and politician progressively deteriorated. The figure of the poet has increasingly distanced itself from that of the man of action, sometimes being perceived as an intellectual who deals with abstract things, or, as described in some reflections, a figure disoriented and detached from reality, almost useless for society. This marginalization of the poet reflects the transition from an oral, collective culture, where the poet was a necessary figure, to a written, individual culture that then led to the age of mass communication. Chapter 9. The Poet. Today, between denunciation and reflection, here's the beautiful irony. Just when we thought poetry was dead, it went viral. Slam poets aren't reciting in libraries, they're screaming on stages about racism, love, trauma, joy, and the crowd. They're not just listening, they're judging, they're voting, they're crying. Instagram poets, forget dusty anthologies. They're dropping 3-line poems that get 2 million likes. Why? Because in a world of noise, poetry is the only thing that cuts through. AI, instead of killing poetry, poets are using it, glitching it, remixing it, turning code into confession. Poetry didn't disappear, it went guerrilla, no longer speaking to empires. It speaks to the broken, the lonely, the furious, the hopeful. The poet today isn't a master of truth for all, they're a whisper in your ear when you need it most. Share this with someone who thinks poetry is dead. Watch their mind explode. If this gave you chills, smash that like button. It tells YouTube, keep funding deep dives like this. Despite the loss of its relevance as a central figure, the role of poetry and the poet has not at all disappeared in the contemporary era. On the contrary, it has recalibrated to adapt to the new challenges of society. In a world dominated by mass culture, which tends to annihilate solitude and reflection, poetry stands as a necessary counterblow, a bulwark and reflection. It is an art that can foster a role of social denunciation, expressing thoughts and feelings with force in a society that can appear hostile. New technologies, while on one hand contributing to the marginalization of poetry on paper, on the other hand have offered new platforms for its dissemination and use. Poetry no longer lives only in books or school anthologies. Online magazines, e-books, and social media have created unprecedented opportunities for exchange and diffusion, allowing poets to reach a vast audience with speed. Forms like slam poetry and electronic poetry are concrete examples of how poetry is finding new ways to reaffirm its relevance, returning to a public and performative dimension, albeit in a radically different context from antiquity. This phenomenon is not a simple revival, but a recalibration of the role of poetry. No longer able to dictate the values of an entire civilization as the ancient poet did, the contemporary poet uses new platforms to create niche communities, to stimulate debate on social issues, and to reaffirm the value of emotion and reflection in an age of fragmentation and distraction. Modern and digital poetry is an attempt to regain social relevance, no longer as a master of truth for everyone, but as a voice that addresses anyone who is willing to seek it out and experience it. Conclusion: poetry as a human necessity. This analysis has shown how poetry differs from prose not only in its verse structure, but in its profound aesthetic nature and its ability to operate on different levels of meaning. The poetic text, with its meter, rhyme, and connotative language, is not a mere stylistic exercise, but an architecture that invites the reader to a collaborative act of interpretation, making every reading a unique and personal experience. The history of Western poetry reflects a pendulum-like movement between the collective and individual dimensions, a journey that has seen it transform from a pragmatic and public art, embodied in the poet as a master of truth, to a private and subjective expression, only to return, in the digital age, to seek a new form of sociality and performativity. Facing the challenges of contemporary society, poetry not only persists, but proves to be more necessary than ever. In a world that tends towards standardization and speed, it remains a space for reflection and a bulwark against superficiality. It is an art that, by exploiting new technologies, can reach new audiences and find new forms, such as slam poetry or electronic poetry. Its function today is not to impose a truth, but to stimulate critical thinking, to create a deep emotional connection, and to reaffirm the value of the word as a unique and human expression of feeling. Poetry, in short, is not a luxury, but an intrinsic necessity of the human experience. A demonstration that the word, when nurtured and lived, can still be a song capable of connecting, moving, and enriching. Let's be clear. Poetry was never about rhyme schemes or dusty books. It's about human connection. It's about truth that hurts. It's about words that heal. In a world drowning in content, poetry is the antidote. In a world racing toward distraction, poetry forces you to pause. In a world shouting opinions, poetry whispers questions. From Greek amphitheaters to your glowing screen at 2 a.m., poetry has always been there, waiting, breathing, ready. And now, it's evolving again. Slam, digital, AI-assisted, community-built. Poetry isn't coming back. It never left. Subscribe if you believe words still have power. Hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Like if this made you feel something. Comment your favorite line, or tag a friend who needs to hear this. This isn't the end, it's an invitation. Poetry is alive, and it's calling you. See you in the comments.